Get on your knees if you want to keep your job. The words didn't echo. They landed, heavy and final, like something that had been said too many times before in rooms just like this one. The conference room fell into a silence, so complete it felt manufactured, like even the air conditioning had paused to listen. Ava Brooks stood at the far end of the glass table, a thin folder still in her hands, her fingers steady even as every pair of eyes in the room shifted toward her without moving their heads. The skyline of downtown Chicago stretched behind her through 40 feet of spotless glass, sunlight bouncing off steel and concrete, reflecting in sharp lines across the polished table where executives sat frozen mid-breath. At the head of it all stood Richard Coleman, his suit immaculate, his posture effortless, one hand resting lightly on the back of his leather chair, as if this moment, like everything else in the room, belonged to him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Ava didn't respond right away, not because she didn't understand, but because something inside her measured the weight of what was being asked, the cost of resisting, the cost of complying. Her badge, clipped neatly to her blazer, caught the light for a second. Temporary staff, contract-based, replaceable. She lowered her eyes, not in submission but in calculation, and slowly set the folder down on the edge of the table. A few seats down, someone shifted uncomfortably, a pin tapping once before going still. No one spoke. No one intervened. The room had already decided what this moment was worth. Ava took a breath, quiet and controlled, then bent her knees and lowered herself carefully onto the cool marble floor. The fabric of her slacks brushed against the surface with a soft, almost inaudible sound, the kind that would have been missed if the room hadn't been so impossibly still. Richard watched without expression, his gaze clinical, detached, as if observing a process rather than a person. "Pick it up," he said, nodding toward the papers he had casually let slide from the table moments earlier. Ava reached forward, her hand steady, fingertips grazing the edge of the document. Up close. The contract was dense, lines of legal language stacked tightly across the page, numbers and clauses woven together with precision. Her eyes moved without hesitation, scanning, absorbing, catching something. Just a flicker at first, a misalignment, a phrase that didn't belong where it was placed. Her hand paused, just for a fraction of a second. Behind her, the city hummed faintly, traffic moving, lives continuing, unaware that inside this sealed room, something small but irreversible had just shifted. Ava gathered the papers neatly, aligning the edges with care, and rose back to her feet in one smooth motion, placing the folder back onto the table exactly where it had been before. She didn't look at Richard immediately. Instead, her gaze lingered on the page she had just read, her mind already turning, already calculating outcomes that stretched far beyond this room. Then, finally, she lifted her eyes, not defiant, not submissive, just steady, and for the briefest moment, something unreadable passed between them. Richard didn't notice. Or if he did, he dismissed it just as quickly. To him, the moment was over. To Ava, it had just begun. The elevator doors closed with a soft chime, sealing Ava inside a narrow box of brushed steel and dim overhead light that hummed faintly above her head. She did not press any button right away. For a moment, she just stood there, shoulders relaxed, hands resting lightly at her sides as if the last 10 minutes had not just unfolded in front of a room full of executives. Then, slowly, she reached out and pressed L, the lobby. The panel lit up, and the elevator began its quiet descent from the 27th floor, each passing level marked by a soft digital tone that echoed just enough to remind her how high up she had been and how far down she was now returning. Her reflection stared back at her from the mirrored walls, slightly distorted by the brushed metal, her expression calm but not empty, focused but not hardened. The badge clipped to her blazer shifted as the elevator moved, catching the light again. Temporary staff, a label that followed her everywhere in this building, a quiet reminder of how easily she could be erased. From it, 8 hours earlier, the same badge had carried her through the side entrance on Wacker Drive, past the security desk where no one ever looked up long enough to remember her face. She had walked in with a paper cup of coffee that cost $1.75, still warm between her hands, the early Chicago air clinging to her coat as the city woke up around her. At home, her mother had already been awake, sitting near the small kitchen window of their South Side apartment, sorting through envelopes that never seemed to stop arriving, hospital bills, insurance notices, statements marked urgent in bold red letters. Ava had not said much when she left. She never did. Words did not change numbers. Instead, she had picked up her bag, checked that the folder she carried was still inside, and stepped out into the cold morning with the same quiet determination she carried everywhere. Back in the elevator, she closed her eyes briefly, replaying the contract in her mind not as text, but as structure, patterns, the way clauses leaned on each other, the way liability shifted depending on a single phrase placed just slightly out of alignment. It had not been obvious. It was never meant to be. But she had seen it, the kind of detail most people skimmed past when they assumed someone else had already checked. The elevator slowed as it reached the lower floors, the hum deepening before softening again. When the doors opened into the lobby, the world felt louder, busier, almost indifferent. Polished marble floors stretched out beneath warm lighting, footsteps echoing in measured rhythms as employees moved in and out, voices low, conversations clipped and efficient. Ava stepped forward, blending into the flow as if she had always been part of it, as if nothing had happened upstairs. No one stopped her. No one asked questions. To them, she was just another employee leaving a meeting she was never meant to be in. But as she crossed the lobby and pushed through the revolving doors into the sharp midday air, something inside her settled into place. Not anger, not resentment, but clarity. The kind that came when you understood exactly what you had seen and exactly what it would cost if no one listened. The office did not slow down after she left. It accelerated, as if the moment she had stood in that room had been a brief interruption rather than a warning. On the 27th floor, the glass doors of the conference room closed again with a soft click, sealing in a different kind of energy, one that moved faster now, sharper, driven by the quiet urgency of a deal that had already been delayed too long. Richard Coleman returned to his seat at the head of the table, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve with precise, practiced movements, his attention already shifting back to the documents spread in front of him. Around him, executives leaned in, voices low but focused, numbers being repeated, timelines confirmed, expectations reinforced with the confidence of people who believed they were in control of every variable in the room. The contract sat exactly where Ava had placed it, pages aligned, edges clean, the ink still fresh from the morning's revisions. Richard flipped it open without hesitation, scanning the top lines again, not because he needed to, but because control, for him, was reinforced through repetition. "We are done reviewing," he said calmly, his voice carrying just enough authority to settle any lingering doubt. "We signed today." A few heads nodded. No one challenged him. Across the table, the legal team exchanged quick glances, one associate tapping a pen lightly against a tablet before stilling his hand, choosing silence over uncertainty. Outside the windows, the city moved in steady patterns, traffic flowing along Lakeshore Drive, sunlight reflecting off the surface of Lake Michigan in sharp, shifting flashes that never reached the room itself. Inside, everything remained controlled, contained, polished. Richard turned to the final page, his signature line waiting, a blank space that represented months of negotiation, millions of dollars, and a future he had already decided was secure. His pen hovered for a fraction of a second, then lowered to the paper with quiet certainty. The stroke was smooth, deliberate, each letter forming with the confidence of someone who had never needed to question the outcome of his own decisions. Around the table, a subtle shift followed, shoulders easing, tension releasing in small, almost invisible ways as the deal moved from possibility to completion. "Congratulations," someone said softly. Another voice followed, then another, the room filling with controlled approval rather than celebration, the kind that belonged in places where success was expected, not earned. Richard closed the folder with a measured motion, his hand resting on top of it for a moment as if to seal it in place. "Send it to Vaughn Capital for final confirmation," he instructed, already standing, already moving on. The meeting dissolved quickly after that, chairs sliding back, papers gathered, conversations resuming in hushed tones as people filed out into the corridor, each carrying their own version of what had just happened. No one mentioned the interruption from earlier. No one revisited the moment when a contract employee had spoken out of turn. It had been dismissed, categorized, forgotten. But as the room emptied, one detail remained exactly where it had been, quiet and unnoticed, embedded deep within the text of the agreement. A single clause that shifted responsibility just enough to change everything. And miles away, walking past a row of brick buildings where the city felt older and less polished, Ava Brooks tightened her coat against the wind, her mind still holding that same clause in perfect clarity, as if it had been etched there permanently, waiting for the moment when someone would finally understand what it meant. By the time the contract reached Vaughn Capital's legal department, the sun had already begun to dip behind the skyline, casting long shadows across rows of glass offices where analysts worked under steady white light that never changed with the hour. The file moved quickly, flagged as high priority, routed through internal systems designed for speed, efficiency, and trust in the people who had already approved it. On the 32nd floor of Vaughn's headquarters, a senior legal advisor named Daniel Reeves opened the document without ceremony, his reading glasses resting low on his nose as he leaned back in his chair, one hand scrolling, the other holding a pen that he rarely used unless something demanded his full attention. At first glance, everything looked standard, clean structure, expected language, the kind of agreement that had been drafted 100 times before with minor variations. But Daniel did not rush. He never did. His eyes moved line by line, not searching for problems, but waiting for them to reveal themselves. Outside his window, the last light of day reflected off neighboring buildings, turning the glass into mirrors that distorted the city into fragments of gold and gray. Inside, the only sound was the faint hum of his computer and the occasional soft tap of his pen against the desk. Then his hand stopped. Not dramatically, not with surprise, but with recognition. A single clause, buried deep within the liability section, shifted the balance of responsibility in a way that did not align with the rest of the agreement. It was subtle, written in language precise enough to avoid immediate suspicion, but clear enough to anyone who knew what they were looking for. Daniel leaned forward slightly, reading it again, slower this time, tracing the sentence structure with the tip of his pen. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. He reached for his phone and dialed without hesitation. Across the city, Richard Coleman had just stepped out of his office, jacket draped over his arm, ready to leave for the evening when his phone vibrated in his hand. He glanced at the screen, saw the name, and answered immediately. "Reeves," he said, his tone steady, already expecting confirmation, not complication. There was a brief pause on the other end, the kind that carried weight without needing explanation. "Richard," Daniel replied, his voice calm but firm. "Before we finalize anything, I need you to look at page 14, subsection C, line 3. The hallway outside Richard's office was quiet, most employees already gone, the building settling into its after-hours rhythm. He frowned slightly, not out of concern, but irritation at the delay. "We have already reviewed the contract," he said, his grip tightening just enough around the phone to register. "Then review it again," Daniel answered, not raising his voice, not softening it either. Another pause followed, longer this time, stretching just enough to shift the balance of the conversation. Richard did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned, walked back into his office, and set his jacket down on the chair without looking at it. The contract was still on his desk, exactly where he had left it, the edges perfectly aligned, the surface untouched since his signature had sealed it hours earlier. He opened it again, flipping directly to the page Daniel had mentioned, his movements controlled but no longer casual. His eyes scanned the section once, then again, slower, more deliberate, the words rearranging themselves in his mind as their meaning settled into place. The room did not change, the city outside continued moving, the lights remained steady, but something inside that space shifted, quiet and irreversible, as the certainty he had carried all day began to fracture under the weight of a detail he had not seen, or worse, had chosen not to see. The silence in Richard's office stretched longer than it should have, not empty, but dense, filled with the quiet weight of realization that did not announce itself all at once, but settled in layers, each one heavier than the last. His eyes stayed fixed on the clause, reading it again, then again, each pass stripping away the confidence he had carried into this deal just hours earlier. The language was precise, carefully constructed, almost elegant in the way it redirected liability without drawing attention, shifting the burden entirely onto his company under conditions that were broad enough to be triggered by events no one could fully control. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in calculation, the kind that came when a mistake could no longer be ignored, only managed. "How bad is it?" he asked finally, his voice lower now, stripped of the authority it had held earlier that day. On the other end of the line, Daniel did not rush to answer. "If this holds," he said evenly, "you are assuming full exposure on any post-merger claims, regulatory, financial, or otherwise. They walk away clean. You carry everything." The words did not rise in volume, but they landed with precision, each one defining the edges of a problem that was already too large to dismiss. Richard leaned back slowly, the leather chair creaking softly beneath him, a sound that seemed louder than it should have in a room that had felt so controlled just minutes before. He looked out at the city, but did not see it, his mind already moving through scenarios, outcomes, timelines, the cascading effect of a single overlooked detail. "We can amend it," he said, more to himself than to Daniel. "Not without their agreement," Daniel replied. Another pause. "And not after you signed." The words settled into place with a finality that did not need emphasis. Richard closed the contract, then opened it again, as if the act itself might change what was written inside. It did not. The clause remained exactly where it had been, quiet, unchanged, waiting to be understood by someone who had taken the time to see it. And then, without warning, another image surfaced in his mind, not from the document, but from earlier that day, a brief moment he had dismissed without thought. Ava Brooks, standing at the edge of the table, her voice steady, her words simple. This contract has a flaw. He had not listened. Worse, he had not even considered the possibility that she might be right. His grip on the phone tightened slightly. "Someone flagged this earlier," he said, the words coming slower now, measured against a memory he could no longer ignore. "Who?" Daniel asked. Richard did not answer immediately. The room felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because control had shifted, subtly but completely, from assumption to uncertainty. "It does not matter," he said after a moment, though the hesitation in his voice suggested otherwise. "It does," Daniel replied, calm but direct. "Because whoever saw this before it was signed might be the only person who can help you unwind it now." The statement hung in the air, simple, undeniable. Richard exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping back to the page, to the exact line that had slipped past an entire team of professionals and landed instead in the hands of someone he had chosen to ignore. Across the city, in a small apartment where the heat clicked on and off with a tired rhythm, Ava sat at a narrow table under a single overhead light, the same clause open in front of her, rewritten in careful notes, margins filled with alternatives, corrections, pathways that could have prevented what had already been set in motion. She paused, pen hovering above the paper, as if sensing something shifting beyond the walls of her room, something that had finally begun to catch up with the truth she had seen hours before. Back in his office, Richard stood up abruptly, the chair sliding back with a muted sound against the floor, his decision forming not from confidence, but from necessity. For the first time that day, he did not know exactly what would happen next, only that the answer he needed was no longer in the room with him. The night settled slowly over the city, not with darkness, but with a dim, steady glow that reflected off windows and pavement, turning everything into soft outlines and muted reflections. In Ava's apartment, the light above the small kitchen table flickered once before holding steady, casting a warm circle over the papers spread neatly in front of her. Outside, a distant siren passed, fading into the background of a neighborhood that never fully slept, just shifted between quieter rhythms. She sat still for a moment, pen resting between her fingers, eyes fixed on the page where she had rewritten the clause from memory, line by line, adjusting the structure, redistributing the liability, restoring balance to something that had been deliberately tilted. Her handwriting was precise, controlled, each annotation placed carefully in the margins, not rushed, not uncertain. This was not new to her. This was what she had trained for, what she had once done in lecture halls and late-night study sessions. long before life had redirected her path into rooms where no one expected her to speak. The heat clicked on again, a soft metallic sound followed by a low hum that filled the silence without breaking it. She leaned back slightly, pressing the pen against her lip, replaying the sequence in her mind. The room. The contract, the moment she had tried to say something that might have changed everything. She did not feel anger. That had passed hours ago, replaced by something steadier, something quieter. Understanding. She knew what she had seen. She knew what it meant. And she knew that by now, someone else had seen it too. Across the city, Richard stood alone in his office. The lights still on though the rest of the floor had gone dark, the building settling into its after-hours stillness. The contract lay open again on his desk, but he was no longer reading it. He was looking past it, through it, trying to trace back the moment where control had slipped without him noticing. His reflection stared back at him from the window, faint against the backdrop of the city lights, a version of himself that felt less certain than it had that morning. His phone rested on the desk, silent now, but heavy with what had already been said and what had not yet been resolved. He walked slowly around the desk, each step measured, deliberate, as if movement itself required thought now. The room felt larger than it had before, not because its dimensions had changed, but because certainty had left it, leaving space behind. He stopped, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the desk, and closed his eyes briefly, not in exhaustion, but in recalibration. For the first time in a long time, he was not the person with the answers. And somewhere in that realization, another image returned, clearer now, sharper than before. Ava Brooks. Not as she had been at the table, but as she had looked up after placing the contract back in front of him. Calm, steady, unshaken by the weight of the room. He had seen it then, but dismissed it. Now it stood out against everything else. Back in her apartment, Ava gathered the papers into a neat stack, tapping them lightly against the table to align the edges. She hesitated for a moment, then slid the top page back into place, as if closing a thought rather than finishing it. Her phone lay face down beside her, untouched, but within reach. She did not expect it to ring. Not because she doubted what she knew, but because she understood how long it sometimes took for truth to reach the people who needed it most. Still, she remained where she was, not waiting, not hoping, simply present, grounded in the quiet certainty that what she had seen could not remain hidden forever. And in the distance, far beyond the walls of both spaces, the city continued moving, unaware that somewhere between two rooms, separated by miles and circumstance, a single overlooked detail had begun to reshape everything. The phone rang just once before Ava picked it up, not out of anticipation, but because she had already decided that if it did, she would answer. The sound had cut cleanly through the quiet of her apartment, sharp but not urgent, a single tone that carried more weight than volume. She did not look at the screen before lifting it, her voice calm when she spoke. Hello. On the other end, there was a pause, not long, but enough to register the shift in who held control of the conversation. Richard Coleman stood in his office, the city lights behind him now fully settled into night, his reflection faint against the glass. He had rehearsed nothing, discarded every version of what he might say before dialing, leaving only what was necessary. This is Richard Coleman, he said, his voice measured, stripped of its usual certainty, carrying something quieter now, something closer to acknowledgement than authority. Ava did not respond immediately. She did not need to. Silence, in that moment, was not absence, it was space, and she let it exist just long enough to be felt. I know who you are, she said finally, her tone even, without edge, without deference. In his office, Richard shifted slightly, one hand resting on the desk as if grounding himself in something solid. You mentioned a flaw in the contract earlier today, he continued, choosing each word carefully, aware now that precision mattered more than control. I reviewed it again. Another pause. You were right. The words settled between them, simple, unembellished, carrying more weight because of what they replaced. Ava leaned back slightly in her chair, her gaze drifting to the papers still neatly stacked in front of her, the same corrections, the same structure she had already worked through hours before. Yes, she said softly, not as confirmation, but as acknowledgement of something that had always been true. Richard exhaled, slow and controlled, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to reveal what had been held in place all evening. "We need to fix it," he said, and for the first time, the statement did not sound like a directive, but a request shaped by necessity. Ava's fingers rested lightly against the edge of the table, tracing the corner of the top page without moving it. "It should have been fixed before it was signed," she replied, not sharply, not accusing, just stating a fact that neither of them could change now. In the silence that followed, the distance between their worlds felt both vast and suddenly irrelevant, reduced to a single line of communication that neither of them had expected to matter this much. Richard closed his eyes briefly, the image of the conference room flashing through his mind, the moment he had dismissed her, the decision that now stood in contrast to everything he needed. "I understand that," he said, and this time, the words carried something new, not just recognition, but responsibility. Another pause. Then, quieter, more direct, "I need your help." The sentence did not rise, did not push, it simply existed, clear and undeniable. Ava did not answer right away. She looked down at the pages in front of her, at the careful notes she had already written, the solutions that had been there long before the problem had been acknowledged. Outside her window, a car passed slowly, headlights sliding across the wall for a brief moment before disappearing. She inhaled, steady, controlled, then spoke, her voice unchanged, grounded, certain. "Come tomorrow," she said. 9 in the morning. There was no negotiation in her tone, no hesitation, just a boundary set with quiet clarity. Richard nodded, even though she could not see him, the motion instinctive, almost reflexive. "I will be there," he replied. The call ended without anything more. No closing words, no formalities. Just silence returning to both rooms, different now than before, not empty, but resolved in a way that neither of them had planned. And as Ava placed the phone back on the table, her hand lingering for a second longer than necessary, the balance between them had already begun to shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the same quiet certainty that had been there from the very beginning. The morning arrived without ceremony, a pale gray light stretching across the city as if the sun itself was hesitant to fully commit. At exactly 9 o'clock, Richard Coleman stood outside a brick apartment building on the south side, his presence sharp against a street that carried a quieter, more grounded rhythm than the glass towers he was used to. His car sat at the curb, engine off, the silence inside it lingering even after he stepped out, adjusting his coat not out of habit, but awareness. Everything here felt different, not lesser, not greater, just real in a way his office never was. He glanced up once, confirming the address, then moved toward the entrance with measured steps, each one deliberate, each one carrying the weight of a decision he had not fully anticipated making the night before. Inside, the hallway was narrow, the lighting soft but uneven, footsteps echoing faintly against walls that had seen years of quiet routines. He stopped outside a door that looked like any other, no sign, no distinction, just a number fixed slightly off-center. For a moment, he did nothing. Then he knocked. The sound was firm but not forceful, a balance he had not consciously chosen, but one that fit the space he now occupied. Inside, Ava Brooks was already standing by the table, the papers neatly arranged exactly as she had left them, the top page turned just enough to reveal the corrected clause. She had not rushed the morning. Coffee sat untouched beside her, the steam long gone, replaced by the steady presence of something far more important. When the knock came, she did not react immediately. She allowed a breath to pass, then another, before walking to the door and opening it without hesitation. Richard stood there, composed but no longer untouchable, his expression controlled but lacking the edge it had carried the day before. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The space between them held everything that had happened, everything that had shifted, everything that could not be undone but could still be understood. Ava stepped aside without a word, allowing him to enter. He did, slower than usual, his gaze moving through the room not with judgment, but observation, taking in details he had never needed to notice before. The table, the papers, the quiet order of a life built without excess, without distraction. Ava returned to the table and rested her hand lightly on the document, not possessive, not guarded, just present. Richard approached, stopping just short of the chair, his attention drawn immediately to the pages in front of her. He recognized the structure before he read a single word, the correction, the balance, the clarity that had been missing from what he had signed. "You already fixed it," he said, not as a question, but as a realization that arrived fully formed. Ava met his gaze briefly, then looked back at the page. "It was never complicated," she replied, her tone steady, not dismissive, just precise. Richard nodded once, absorbing that, understanding it in a way that did not require explanation. He reached out, then paused, his hand hovering just above the paper, as if asking permission without saying it. Ava did not stop him. He picked up the document, reading, slower than he had the day before, each line settling into place with a clarity that had been absent when he had assumed control without question. When he finished, he lowered the pages carefully, placing them back exactly where they had been. The room remained quiet, but not empty. This silence was different. It held recognition, not distance. Richard straightened slightly, his posture no longer commanding, but aligned with something more grounded. "Thank you," he said, the words simple, unembellished, carrying none of the authority he once relied on, only sincerity shaped by necessity and understanding. Ava did not respond immediately. She did not need to. Her presence in the room, the work on the table, the clarity she had carried from the beginning, said enough. And in that moment, without declaration, without spectacle, something had shifted completely, not in status, not in titles, but in truth, where one had finally learned to see, and the other had never needed to be anything but herself. The paper remained on the table between them, unchanged in form but entirely different in meaning, its clean lines and corrected structure reflecting something far beyond legal language. Ava stepped back slightly, giving space not out of hesitation, but intention, allowing the moment to settle without forcing it forward. Richard stood still for a second longer than necessary, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the table, his gaze fixed on the document as if it were both a solution and a mirror. Outside, the muted sounds of the street filtered faintly through the window, distant engines, footsteps, a passing voice, all continuing without interruption, unaware that inside this small room, something far more significant than a contract had shifted. Richard reached into his coat slowly, not with the sharp precision he once carried, but with a measured awareness of what he was about to do. He pulled out a business card, the edges crisp, the lettering embossed, his name printed in a font that had always carried weight in every room he entered. For a moment, he held it between his fingers, then placed it on the table, sliding it toward Ava with a motion that was careful, almost restrained. "If you ever consider returning," he said, his voice steady but softer than before, "there would be a place for you." The words were offered without pressure, without expectation, simply placed there, like the card itself. Ava glanced at it briefly, her eyes taking in the name, the title, everything it represented. Then she looked back up at him, her expression unchanged, grounded in the same quiet certainty she had carried from the beginning. "I never left what I know how to do," she replied, her tone even, not dismissing the offer, but reframing it in a way that did not depend on his recognition. Richard nodded slowly, absorbing that, understanding it in a way that did not require agreement or response. The distance between them was no longer defined by position, but by perspective, and in that space, something more balanced had taken its place. He picked up the corrected document once more, not to review it again, but to hold it, to carry forward what had been restored within its pages. Then he stepped back, giving a small nod, not formal, not performative, just acknowledgement, before turning toward the door. Ava did not follow. She remained where she was, her hand resting lightly against the table, her eyes calm, steady, present. The door opened with a soft sound, then closed just as quietly behind him, leaving the room as it had been, simple, still, complete. A few minutes later, the sound of his footsteps faded down the hallway, replaced again by the low, familiar rhythm of the building, life continuing without pause. Ava returned to the table, gathering the papers with the same care she had shown from the start, aligning the edges, stacking them neatly, not as an ending, but as a continuation of something that had never depended on recognition to exist. She picked up her pen, turning it once between her fingers before setting it down again. her gaze drifting briefly toward the window where the morning light had strengthened, filling the room with a quiet, steady warmth. There were no words left to say, no gestures needed to confirm what had already been understood. The moment did not demand closure, only presence. And in that stillness, where nothing needed to be proven and nothing needed to be taken back, the truth remained, simple and unspoken, that dignity, once held, did not require permission, and that the kind of strength built in silence did not disappear just because someone else had finally learned to see it.